My family replaced me while I was rebuilding my life. Then the truth came out in front of everyone. My name is Diana Moreno. I'm 34 years old. 5 years ago, I lost everything in the span of 14 months. My marriage ended. My business failed. I had a breakdown that I did not call a breakdown for 2 years because calling it that required admitting that something had broken inside me, and I was not yet ready to admit that. I moved back to my hometown of Claremont, California. I moved into the house where I had grown up. I slept in the bedroom I had occupied as a teenager, with the same view of the same oak tree I had looked at every morning from age 12 to 17. I was 30 years old and I was starting over, and I told myself that was acceptable. That starting over at 30 was not a failure. That many people started over. That the circumstances had been difficult and that what mattered was what I did next. My family was there. My parents, Robert and Elena. My sister Camille, who lived 20 minutes away with her husband Greg and their 2 young children. My brother Daniel, who lived 40 minutes in the other direction. The whole structure of origin, available and close. What I did not know, when I moved into that house, was that the structure I was returning to had been quietly renegotiating itself during the years I had been away. That the roles people played had shifted. That what had appeared from a distance to be a stable family had been reorganizing itself around a set of understandings and loyalties that I had not been present to witness or participate in. What I also did not know was that my grandmother, my father's mother, Rosaria, 83 years old, living in the same Claremont house she had occupied for 49 years, had been watching all of this, had been keeping her own record, had been thinking about what she had seen and what she intended to do about it. Rosaria died 16 months after I came home. What she left behind rearranged everything. And what came out in the process of that rearrangement, about my family, about the years I had been away, about the specific shape of the thing I had returned to, is the story I am here to tell you. If you have ever come home to find that home had changed while you were gone, stay with me. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever had to learn a place all over again. I need to start with Rosaria, because without understanding who she was, nothing else in this story makes sense. Rosaria Moreno was born in 1940 in a small town in Jalisco, Mexico. She came to California in 1958, at the age of 18, with her older brother and the specific combination of optimism and practicality that seems to characterize people who move toward possibility rather than away from difficulty. She worked as a seamstress, then as a tailor in a shop on the main street of Claremont that she eventually co-owned, then owned outright after her partner retired. She married my grandfather, Eduardo, in 1961. They had 3 children. My father, Robert, was the middle child. Eduardo died in 1992, the year I was born, which means I never met him, but I grew up understanding him through Rosaria's stories and through the specific way his presence persisted in her house even 30 years after he was gone. The tailor's shop was sold in 2001 when Rosaria retired. By then the house had been paid off for 20 years and her savings, invested with the same careful discipline she applied to everything, had grown into something substantial. She did not talk about money in specific terms. But she was comfortable in a way that was visible not through display but through the absence of anxiety. She did not worry about things the way people who worry about money worry about things. She was small and precise and had the specific quality of someone who has spent decades in a craft that requires absolute attention to detail, who has learned, through the practical necessity of making things fit, that approximation is the enemy of function. She was also generous with a directness that was almost startling. She gave without performance. She noticed what people needed and she addressed it without making them feel observed. She also had a quality that I have thought about often in the years since her death. She understood the difference between what people said and what they meant. She had been reading people for 80 years with the focused attention of someone who started out with almost nothing and had learned that the accurate reading of other people was one of the most valuable skills available to a person with limited resources. She was rarely fooled. And when she was fooled, she eventually figured it out, and she adjusted accordingly. When I came back to Claremont at 30, broken and rebuilding, Rosaria was the person I went to see first. Before I unpacked, Before I told my parents the full story of what had happened, I drove to her house on Alcott Street, sat at her kitchen table, and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she made me a cup of coffee and set a plate of the particular cookies she had been making my whole life, a Jalisco recipe she had brought with her in 1958, and she said, "You are still here. That is the first thing. Everything else is next." It was not a comfortable thing to say. It was a true thing. And from Rosaria, the true thing was always more valuable than the comfortable one. Let me tell you what had happened in the 14 months before I came home, because the story does not start with my return to Claremont. It starts earlier, with the specific accumulation of events that produced someone who needed to start over. I had married Marcus Hale in 2013, when I was 23 years old. I had met him in my final year of university. He was 2 years ahead of me, already working in product design, already with the particular confidence of someone whose early success had not yet been tested by difficulty. I found that confidence attractive at 22. I understood it differently at 28. We were, on the outside, a good match. Both ambitious. Both interested in building things. We moved to San Francisco after my graduation and both of us worked hard, in the specific way that people work when they are building toward something they believe in. He at design firms, then at a startup. Me at a marketing agency, then at my own small consulting practice that I built over 4 years and that was, by 2017, genuinely viable. 4 employees. A client list that included a regional grocery chain and 2 mid-sized technology companies. What was happening inside the marriage during those same years was a different story. Marcus was someone whose relationship to his own worth was deeply connected to his professional success. When things went well at work, he was the person I had fallen in love with, generous, curious, engaged with me and with the life we were building. When things went badly at work, which happened twice in significant ways during our 6 years together, he became someone I did not recognize as consistently. Not violent, I want to be clear about that. But withdrawn in ways that punished. Critical in ways that were designed to wound. Capable of a specific kind of sustained coldness that I came to understand as the emotional equivalent of territory marking. A way of establishing that the difficulty he was feeling was my responsibility to navigate around. I stayed longer than I should have. This is something I have spent a great deal of time examining, with a therapist and with myself, and I have arrived at a relatively honest accounting of why. I stayed because I believed that the good version of Marcus was the real version, and the difficult version was a temporary manifestation of circumstance. I stayed because I had built something with him, not just the marriage but a life, a city, a social world, and dismantling it felt like a second failure layered on the professional failures I was watching him process. I stayed because leaving required a kind of certainty I had not yet developed. The certainty arrived in 2018, in the form of a specific conversation in which Marcus said something to me that I will not repeat verbatim, but that constituted a clear statement about his assessment of my value. Not my professional value, my value as a person. It was said quietly and without apparent anger, which made it more precise than if it had been said in rage. It landed clearly. I left. Moved out, found an apartment, filed the paperwork. The divorce took 8 months and was not simple and is not the part of this story I need to dwell on except to say, it took from me what divorces take from the person who initiates them in circumstances like mine. Not money. We had kept our finances relatively separate and the settlement was straightforward. It took energy and attention, and a particular kind of hope I had been carrying about the life I was building, and it left the place where that hope had been feeling hollowed in a way I could not immediately fill. In the middle of the divorce, my consulting practice lost its 2 largest clients. Both decisions were made for reasons that were clearly business-related and had nothing to do with my performance. One client was acquired. One was restructuring. But the timing was its own kind of statement from the universe. The practice could have survived losing one of them. It could not survive losing both within 3 months of each other. I spent 4 months trying to replace what I had lost. I was not at my best during those 4 months. The divorce was ongoing, I was sleeping badly, and I was making decisions about my business from a state of scarcity and anxiety that is not the optimal state for decision-making. I made some misjudgments. I overextended on a contract that did not materialize. By January 2019, I was looking at the honest numbers and understanding that the practice was not recoverable in its current form. I dissolved it in February, paid off the remaining obligations, gave my 4 employees as much notice and help as I could manage, and closed. The breakdown, the thing I did not call a breakdown for 2 years, was not a single event. It was a period of approximately 6 months in which I was not fully functional, and in which I was not honest with anyone about the extent to which I was not functional, including myself. I went through the motions. I applied for jobs and sometimes got interviews and sometimes performed adequately in those interviews and sometimes did not. I told my family I was fine, which is what I had always told them and what they had always accepted because I had always, before this, been fine. In August 2019, I called my mother and told her the truth. That I was not fine. That I needed to come home. She said of course. She said come now. She said the room was ready. I drove from San Francisco to Claremont the following weekend. What I did not know when I arrived was the shape that my family had taken during the 6 years I had been away. I had been away for 6 years in the sense that San Francisco was 6 years and 400 miles, and a life that was mine rather than theirs. I had not been away in the sense of absence. I had come home for Christmas and Thanksgiving and significant birthdays and occasional long weekends, and I had called and texted and stayed involved in the way that adult children who have moved away stay involved. I was present in the information sense. I just was not present in the daily sense. Daily presence, I came to understand after I returned, is what builds the actual architecture of a family. Not the holiday visits. Not the phone calls. The ordinary Tuesday. The dinner that happens on a Tuesday in October when nothing is happening and everyone is just there. Those Tuesdays are where the real negotiations occur, about who everyone is to each other, about whose needs are primary, about what the group's understanding of itself is. I had missed 6 years of Tuesdays. In those 6 years, my sister Camille had become the center of the family's daily life. She lived 20 minutes away. Her children, Lily, who was now 7, and Jack, who was 4, were my parents' primary grandchildren and the organizing focus of a significant portion of family time and energy. This was natural. This was appropriate. I did not begrudge it. What I came to understand more slowly was that Camille's centrality had also produced a certain set of dynamics that were less natural. A way of positioning herself as the interpreter of family needs. A tendency to speak for my parents in ways that went beyond practical coordination. A habit of presenting her understanding of situations as the family's understanding, without checking whether the family had in fact reached that understanding independently. My sister is not a bad person. I want to say that clearly and mean it. She is someone who has a strong instinct for organization and control that she applies to everything, including people, without always distinguishing between the domains where those instincts are appropriate and the domains where they are not. The domain where they were not appropriate was my life. When I came home in August 2019, Camille was involved in my return in ways I had not anticipated and had not invited. She had opinions about how I should structure my recovery that she shared with my parents before she shared them with me. She had concerns about my mental state that she communicated to my mother in terms that I later learned were more alarming than the situation warranted. She had, I gradually understood, been building a narrative about what had happened to me and what it meant and what I needed that she had shared broadly within the family before I had the opportunity to present my own account. This is not an unusual dynamic. I recognize it as something that happens in families, particularly in families where one person has been physically present while others have been absent and the present person has, over time, expanded their territory by simply occupying it. It is not malicious, but it has effects. The effect on me was a sense, in the first months of being home, of being managed. Of having my situation filtered through Camille's interpretation before it reached other people. Of having my own understanding of myself be in constant competition with her version, which had been established earlier and more thoroughly in the family's understanding. I did not address this directly in the first months. I was not in a position to address anything directly. I was doing the work of stabilizing, finding a therapist, which I did in September 2019 and with whom I would work for the next 2 years. Getting enough sleep, eating properly, doing the small, undramatic work of reconstruction. But I filed what I noticed, the way you file things when you are not yet ready to do anything with them. Rosaria noticed different things. She told me this much later, in pieces, over the months between my return and her death. We spent time together regularly. I would drive to Olcott Street 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes we cooked. Sometimes we sat in the garden she had been tending for 49 years, in the chairs she had purchased in 1978 that were still perfectly serviceable. Sometimes we just drank coffee and talked or did not talk, which was a specific comfort I had not known I needed until I experienced it again. She told me, at one of these visits, that she had been watching the family more carefully in the years since Eduardo died than most people understood. When you are alone in a house, she said, you have a lot of time to pay attention to the people who come through it. I asked her what she had noticed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have noticed that the people who are loudest about what the family needs are not always the people who are most concerned about the family. Sometimes they are the people who are most concerned about themselves. I did not ask her who specifically she meant. I thought I understood. I want you to know something, she said. I see you clearly. I saw you before you left, and I see you now that you are back and you are the same person. Different circumstances. Same person. I told her what that meant to me to hear. She nodded once and went back to her coffee. That was how she delivered important things. Quickly, without ceremony, in the middle of ordinary conversation, and then moved on before the weight of them could become embarrassing. During the fall and winter of 2019, I slowly began to rebuild. I found part-time work at a marketing agency downtown, not the kind of position I had held 6 years earlier, not my own company, but real work that engaged my skills and that gave me structure. I went to therapy twice a week. I ran every morning. I read more than I had read in years, which was partly a function of having time and partly a function of needing to be somewhere inside my own head without the pressure of producing anything. The tension with Camille was quieter during this period. Not resolved, I do not want to suggest it had resolved when it had not, but less active. I was not challenging her interpretation of anything. I was focused internally, and the focused internal version of me did not create friction with the managing version of her. My relationship with my parents during this period was genuinely good. My father, Robert, was quiet and steady in the way he had always been, a man who expressed care through practical acts rather than emotional language, who fixed things that were broken in my car without being asked, and who sometimes left groceries I mentioned needing on the kitchen counter without making a production of it. My mother, Elena, was warmer in expression and more emotionally engaged, and our conversations during those months were some of the more honest we had had in years. I think the breakdown, the thing I had finally named as what it was, had produced in me a willingness to be less guarded than I had been. I had spent 6 years performing competence. Performing fine. The performance had cost something, and what came after its end was, paradoxically, a kind of openness that made me easier to be with. My parents responded to this openness with their own. My father told me things about his early years, about struggles I had not known he had had, about a period before my mother that he had never mentioned. My mother talked about her own relationship with her identity, about the specific complexity of being a Mexican-American woman in a profession where that identity was both invisible and hypervisible depending on the moment. These were not conversations we had had before. The circumstances that had seemed catastrophic when I was in them had produced, as one of their byproducts, a depth in my relationships with my parents that I had not had before. Rosaria was watching this too. She mentioned it once, in the way she mentioned things, you are letting people see you now. That is new. I told her the old way had not been working. No, she said. It hadn't. In February 2020, I was offered a full-time position at the agency. A real position, with a real salary and benefits and a trajectory that made sense given where I was and where I wanted to go. I accepted it. That same month, Rosaria fell.